Hi everyone, and welcome to our history podcast. Today we are traveling to medieval England, where kings fought wars, parliament started to rise, and some rulers, well, let's just say they weren't exactly made for the crown.
Oh yes, in this episode we'll meet the three Edwards, watch the parliament slowly grow into a real political force, get caught up in a century-long war with France, and then finish with a king who managed to lose it all.
So, battles, betrayals, parliaments, and even a revolt or two. Basically, a medieval soap opera. Before we jump into Edward I, we need to set the stage. England had already been through a lot, and the Normans invaded in 1066. Henry II built the foundations of English law. Richard the Lionheart went on crusades, and King John was so unpopular that his barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215.
Right, the Magna Carta basically said, "Hey king, you're not above the law." A medieval way of saying, chill out, you can't just take our money and land whenever you feel like it.
And by the mid-200s, Simon de Montfort had even summoned an early parliament with not only nobles but also knights and townsmen. So when Edward I became king, the idea of shared power was already bubbling.
Edward I was tall, ambitious, and tough. They called him Longshanks because of his height, and the Hammer of the Scots because he spent so much time trying to crush them.
He was also a reformer. He divided the courts into King's Bench, Exchequer, and Common Pleas. That's the skeleton of England's modern legal system.
And in 1295, he summoned the Model Parliament, which included not only lords and clergy, but also knights and the bourgeoisie. That meant that Parliament wasn't just for nobles anymore.
Fun fact, Edward also loved castles. After conquering Wales, he built a whole chain of massive fortresses like Carnarvon and Harlech. They weren't just military bases, they were power statements, like, hello Wales, guess who's in charge now?
But Scotland was tougher. William Wallace and later Robert the Bruce kept resisting. Edward won battles, but never completely conquered them.
So Edward I left a legacy of strong government, legal reform and expansion, though not always successful expansion.
And then came his son, Edward II.
Which is when things got messy. Edward II was nothing like his father. Instead of being strong and respected, he relied heavily on his favorites, especially Piers Gaveston, showering them with titles and land.
Which annoyed the nobles. I mean, imagine working hard to run the kingdom and then the king keeps rewarding his best friend instead.
And when he tried to follow in his father's footsteps and fight the Scots, well, Bannockburn in 1314 was a disaster. Robert the Bruce completely crushed the English army.
Fun fact, Edward loved hobbies like rowing and digging ditches with peasants, which is sweet, but not exactly what people expected from a medieval king.
His novels eventually rebelled, and the ultimate betrayal, his wife, Isabella, teamed up with Roger Mortimer and overthrew him. Edward II was forced to abdicate in favor of his son.
He became the first English king formally deposed by Parliament. which is kind of ironic. His father had strengthened Parliament, and now Parliament ended up kicking him off the throne.
Luckily, his son turned out to be the complete opposite.
Yes, Edward III. Finally, some competence again. Edward III brought the energy back, ambitious, chivalrous, and hungry for glory. He restored royal authority.
He even created the Order of Garter, a chivalric order still around today. According to legend, it started when a lady dropped her garter at a dance, and Edward picked it up saying, "Shame on him who thinks evil of it." Smooth move, Edward.
But his biggest legacy was the 100 Years' War. When the French King Charles IV died without a son, Edward claimed the French throne through his mother.
And that kicked off over a century of war. Edward's early campaigns were brilliant. The English longbowmen destroyed French armies at battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. At Poitiers, Edward's son, the Black Prince, even captured the French king.
Imagine the headlines. English teenager captures the King of France. Instant medieval superstar.
Meanwhile, at home, Edward kept needing money for war, which meant calling Parliament more often. Every tax meant more bargaining, so the commons, representing knights and townsmen, grew more powerfully.
So, while Edward III was busy fighting in France, something else was happening back in England. Parliament was rising.
Exactly. Wars made kings weaker and parliaments stronger. By the 14th century, Parliament had split into two houses, the Lords and the Commons. The Commons represented the wider community, well, not peasants, but at least landowners and merchants.
Their greatest weapon was money. Kings couldn't tax without Parliament's approval. So the Commons would say, "We'll give you money, but only if you fix our complaints."
That slowly turned Parliament into a permanent institution. Edward I gave it a structure. Edward II showed how it could depose a king, and Edward III made it essential by constantly needing funds.
So the monarchy was no longer absolute. It was becoming a constitutional system step by step.
But let's go back to Edward III's biggest obsession, the 100 Years' War.
Oh yes, England versus France. Round 1 million. The war lasted 116 years, though not continuously. It was like one long family feud mixed with bursts of fighting.
The causes: succession disputes, English claims to French land, and trade rivalries, especially the wool trade, which was England's economic lifeline.
In the early years, England had the upper hand. Longbowmen at Crécy and Poitiers shredded the French knights, who still clung to traditional cavalry charges.
The English also scored a famous victory later in Agincourt under Henry V. But over time, the French adapted. Leaders like Bertrand du Guesclin and later Joan of Arc inspired the French to fight back.
By the end, England lost almost everything except Calais. Ouch.
Fun fact: The war also created a strong sense of national identity in both countries. Before that, people mostly identify with their region or their lord. Now, English and French identities started to solidify.
And at home, the constant need for money meant Parliament was gaining more and more power.
And then came Richard II, who shows what happens when a king forgets just how powerful Parliament and the people had become.
Oh yes, this is where it all unravels. Richard became king at just 10 years old. A child on the throne always spells trouble.
His reign started with the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Thousands of peasants, angry about high taxes and serfdom, marched on London, led by Wat Tyler.
Richard, still a teenager, actually faced the mob bravely and promised reforms. For a moment, he looked like a hero.
But once the revolt ended, he took it all back. Not exactly a trust-building move.
As he grew older, Richard became more authoritarian. He ignored Parliament, played favorites, and spent extravagantly.
Eventually, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who had been exiled, returned with an army. Richard was deposed in 1399, and Henry became Henry IV, starting the Lancastrian dynasty.
Richard's fall was dramatic. He went from boy king to deposed monarch. And it showed that ignoring Parliament was a recipe for disaster.
So, to sum up, Edward I was strong and clever. Edward II was a disaster. Edward III was glorious but expensive. And Richard II, well, he lost it all.
Meanwhile, Parliament quietly grew from a council of nobles into a powerful institution, thanks to kings constantly needing money.
Wars, revolts, castles, betrayals. Medieval England had more drama than a Netflix series.
Honestly, all that's missing are dragons.
True, but at least we got longbows, revolts, and a few very dramatic downfalls.